So, good morning again for the people gathered in this audience. This is one of the first sessions of this forum, of the 11th Gaidar Forum held in the RANEPA. It so happens that, well, of course, it's a major political event, but also it's an academic forum. And our session today is devoted to more of an academic subject. At least half of it is academic. It is about the modern monetary theory, or a new monetary theory, a very popular thing, something discussed very much in the economic science, in academic science. The discussions are going on pages of scientific journals, and there's a lot of discussion in the political circles in the United States and Europe and Russia. The people who are interested in this particular subject have heard this term many times already and thought about it. And I hope that this session is going to help figure out what it is all about. What is the modern monetary theory is all about? Is it an academic, a purely theoretical thing, or can it be used in practice? Today, we have three main participants, panelists. Professor of Harvard University, Kenneth Rogoff, Professor of Texas University in Austin, James Galbraith, and Minister of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, Maxim Oreshkin. We also have three experts participating. Well, the third expert is still coming. It's Oleg Vyugin, Chairman of the Supervisory Board of the Moscow Exchange. Then Oleg Zamulin, Director of Center of Macroeconomic Research of Sberbank and Director of Center of Financial Technologies of Skolkovo. Oleg Shibanov, he's still coming. First, let's start off with a question to the panelists. The first main question is what the modern monetary theory is all about.
I'm not sure I'm the right person to start with. But I would say my read of modern monetary theory, and with all respect, which I do have for my fellow panelists, I would say it's not modern, it's not monetary, and it's not a theory. It's not modern. The idea traces back to Abba Lerner in the 1940s. He was a great economist, this idea of functional finance. Most importantly, it's not monetary. It's really about fiscal policy. It's about the idea that you can run large deficits using, and this is my view of it, very, very short-term debt. Call it money, but it's not really any more than bank reserve. It's like interest-paying bank reserves in order to finance the program. And it's not theory in the conventional modern economic sense in that you don't really see equations. There are reams of papers, it's true, in academic journals. There are primers on modern monetary theory, but they don't use equations, and I think I think it's fair to say there's not quite a unified theory. I'm very sympathetic to the idea of promoting inclusive growth, and certainly in my country there's great scope for the government to do a much better job than it does in lessening income inequality, making the economy more productive. I think, however, that there's not a shortcut to this through these ideas in modern monetary theory. And I'd lastly say, I mentioned that it's not really a theory, it's not really empirical either. Some people say Japan used modern monetary theory, although certainly Governor Kuroda of the Central Bank of Japan denies this. I do think, and I'll talk about it more, if you look at history, there are many Latin American countries that used something like modern monetary theory. I refer to a book by my thesis advisor, the late Rudiger Dornbusch, with Sebastian Edwards at UCLA. We also have Jeffrey Sachs in the audience, and he has many excellent writings, but I'd particularly point to his intermediate macro textbook with Felipe Lorraine that also gives many examples that I would interpret of saying why this is a dangerous idea. So let me stop there.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Very interesting start of this discussion. James, question to you. What's your opinion?
Modern monetary theory, it is a descriptive analysis of how credit-based monetary systems actually work, and it has policy implications. But it is above all, an analysis of the functioning of actual credit-based systems. The word modern in the phrasing is borrowed, and this is very consciously done, from the treatise on money published in 1930 by John Maynard Keynes, who in his opening pages describes the modern monetary systems as those that have been in place for at least the last 5,000 years. So the question of what is modern and what is not can be discussed, but that's the meaning of the term in the use in the phrase modern monetary theory. In a credit-based system, liquidity is created by lending, which is to say, when a bank makes loans, that creates a deposit, which is bank money. Or it may be created by fiat, which is to say, by the expenditure of the state. Taxes and enforceable loan contracts are necessary, but they're not necessary to raise money for the state or for the bank, but rather to give value to the money that is created. You have to have money, or the state's money, in order to pay the state's taxes. A country with sovereign control over its money, a country which is effectively independent in this sense, and such countries do exist, is constrained. But it's constrained by its real resources, by its human capital and its physical capital, in the capacity of what it can do, and by its organizational capacities, in its ability to mobilize these resources. It is not constrained by financial factors. And that is why when Keynes wrote about this, what he said back in the 1930s was that anything we can actually do, we can afford. The financing of these matters is not a constraint unless by arbitrary and capricious and unnecessary measures, it is made into a constraint as the result of following an effective misguided economic orthodoxy. So modern monetary theory stands with Keynes, it stands with Albert Lerner, and it stands with the common sense of how money and credit systems actually work.
Mr. Galbraith has just said that many points of the new or modern monetary theory had been proposed by Keynes and in Japan and etc. Nonetheless, what we're talking about here, well, we started talking about this theory right now. What do you think about this, Maxim? Well, first of all, the theme of modern monetary theory, there's a lot of publications on this subject. They vary. Sometimes they're contradictory to each other. This is a popular subject, not only in the economic environment, but the political environment as well. A lot of references to this theory right now. And they say that the founding fathers who wrote the first papers on this, they never expected this kind of turn to the evaluation of modern monetary theory. And some people are negative about this theory. Remember, back way in the Soviet Union, they say, I never read Pasternak, the author, but I can discuss this. And the same applies here. Some people don't know about it, but still discuss it. But, you know, in any theory, in any paper, you can find sound ideas. And you don't have to borrow all of it from them. There are good ideas there. Some ideas are not properly interpreted. Let me go through some of these ideas. Like it says directly, inflation is the main measure of the inefficiency of economic policy. Mr. Galbraith spoke about this. The constraints in real resources in the economy on the side of the supply, well, that's the real constraint, and we have inflation. If the demand goes beyond what we are constrained about, a high inflation or low inflation, there's always signs of economy being sick. Something's wrong in the economy when it goes beyond this certain range. And a second thing here, and I think this is a correct idea, that nominal indicators should not ever be considered out of context. Well, their inflation is 0% or something. That depends on the context of the economy. Like in the Eurozone, you can see right now that over the past 10 years, the level of budget deficit was lower and should be for normal development of the economy. The Eurozone suffered, well, they selected the path of suffering, so to speak, and during the past 10 years, they've been in a situation of high unemployment, or the size of the debt in the situation of Japan or China or other countries. You should always consider those situations based on the context. This idea, replacement of private investment by government spending, again, this should be considered within context to understand what's happening in a particular economy and what should be the response to a particular action. If we have a shortage of expenses within the economy, evidently, government expenses would not replace private investment. It would support private investment and private expenses. And if we're at the limit of our production capacity, then in this situation, government expenditure would replace private investment indeed. And when somebody says that you can print money indefinitely and have unlimited budget deficit, this is, of course, not right as well. I have heard this idea from the colleagues. Mr. Galbraith said that the constraint of the real resources, this is the key idea, and I agree with this. And this comes from New Keynesian theory, this approach of overheating the economy and gaps appearing out of that would be based, well, to a large extent, lack of demand in the economy. A lot of discussion around this theme and why so. I think there's a simple answer to that. People see what is happening in the modern economy. Like back in the 1930s, the response to the Great Depression, while Keynesian theory came about as a response, and people see what's happening in the Eurozone, a high level of unemployment for a long period of time, and no clear economic response to that. And the situation in Japan, where the state debt is more than 200% of GDP, and nothing's happening. No problem with borrowing or the cost of debt. All these cases of the past 12 years show that the economic, well, people try to respond to the situation, try to explain what's happening. This is normal that this discussion started, that will bring us forward without no doubt about that. Thank you. Maxim spoke about the Eurozone. And although monetary theory in literature would be associated with the United States of America as a case study, but recently Christine Lagarde, the governor of the Central Bank of Europe, said that we believe we should move to a new mix of European economic policy with some key elements. One of them is budgetary policy, not only an amount of expenses, but the structure of expenses as well. This is one of the ideas that is being discussed within interaction of monetary and fiscal policy within the modern monetary theory. So, my question is this to the panelists. What's your take of this phrase? Do you think that the new governor of the European Bank would be calling for the increase in budget expenses in accordance with the tenets of modern monetary theory. James.
I've known a lot of central bankers. Early in my career, I was responsible for establishing the congressional oversight of monetary policy of the central bank in the United States. So going back 50 years, I've known a lot of them. And I will say that all competent central bankers and all competent Treasury officials do, in fact, grasp the essentials of how the modern monetary system works. This is their business. Banking and central banking are about extending credit, providing liquidity for economic activity. And they act on those principles when it is necessary to do so. Whether they will admit to this in public is another matter. Occasionally, in the case of, for example, Ben Bernanke, in the middle of the crisis, they would admit to it and say so frankly that what they're doing is extending and creating new liquidity, and they're doing so by means of essentially electronic transactions. But usually, they don't admit to it. Now, as for Madame Lagarde, she is trained as a lawyer. And as a lawyer, it is a principle that you say what is most convenient for your case and not what you necessarily personally believe. So I can't speak for what she believes. And I suspect that when she makes the comment that you quote, that what she is doing is trying to protect the European Central Bank, which she is now responsible for, from pressures to act on economic matters that they would prefer to pass off to national governments and legislatures who probably won't act on them either. But this is therefore a political matter. So if she is in agreement with me on a basic idea, which is that it is necessary at the present juncture for national governments to take responsibility for a major part of how the economy functions to ensure high employment and adequate rate of growth and public investments necessary to improve the standard of living and for environmental sustainability. This is probably not out of conviction on her part, but rather what the French call an alliance de convenance. However, I'm not going to complain, and I will take what I can get. When I have a practical alliance with a central banker, I'm happy to make use of it without necessarily holding them to a deep belief in any particular principles, and particularly not if the central banker happens to have a training in law.
Окей. Кеннет, ваше мнение?
Kenneth, what do you think about it?
I mean, I agree, except for the comments about Madame Lagarde, I agree with much of Professor Galbraith said. Obviously, it's the government's responsibility to try to promote growth. Public investment's important, private investment, investment in education. There are many tools for doing this. The European Central Bank, which the minister spoke about, it is a very difficult case because there isn't a central government. I think an amazing number of people don't understand, probably in Russia they do, but in the United States and United Kingdom, I think they don't, is that the central bank is independent, but it does not have its own balance sheet. The government owns 100% the central bank. When the central bank creates credit, it's not doing anything that the Treasury couldn't do if it felt like it. But what the central bank, for its independence, I think that's been one of the great achievements of the last 25, 30 years, but it does not have the political legitimacy of the government. There are limits. So we can come to it later, but there have been proposals, including by Ben Bernanke, for helicopter money, where the central bank steps in, where the fiscal authorities fail to, in order to pass out money to people. If it were to do that, it would quickly not be independent. It just doesn't have the political legitimacy. But Europe's more complicated because there is not a single European fiscal authority, not a meaningful one. There's not a single European government. And I actually feel the European Central Bank has stretched to what it can do, and it does massive redistribution from the rich countries of the north to the poorer countries in the south under the table, but it's not able to do nearly enough. And lastly, on Madame Lagarde, I think she'll be a great president of the European Central Bank, but it is a very difficult job because the central bank is being asked to do far more than it really has the political legitimacy to do. And until the national governments step in, and I think actually unify more. I think we need to see a centralized fiscal authority in Europe. We're going to continue this very difficult relationship.
Уважаемые профессора, наши гости пришли к согласию по данному вопросу. Максим Станиславович.
Our professors, our panelists have been in agreement on this. I think that what has been said is quite correct. Madame Lagarde is a politician. She is also a person who acts practically, and she is very realistic. 3% of the GDP was kind of a dogma, and one should not follow dogma in real life. We should follow the reality of our life. Eurozone is the example of a failure of macroeconomic policy. I agree with what my colleague said. That is that a lot of it has to do with lack of fiscal union in the Eurozone. There are institutional reasons for what has happened. When Madame Lagarde says today that expenditures should increase and the budget should grow, who in Europe is going to do that? The Germans don't want to do that, although they can. In the rest of the Eurozone, it would be perfect if Germans started spending their money in Italy, in Spain, and in Greece. Then we would see a better balanced situation and things would be going in the right direction. However, we see institutional constraints in the lack of a fiscal union. So Madame Lagarde, with the zero interest rates, and central bank can do very little to stimulate growth. She can only talk about budget policy, not mentioning anyone specifically. She realizes that this is the only way to overcome deficit and lack of demand that Europe is witnessing today. Indeed, all panelists talked about the need to be careful with things like budget deficit and debt. We have heard the example of Japan, where the debt is in excess of 200% of GDP, but that is hardly a threat to their stability. We also hear a lot about the possibility of a new financial crisis that would also have to do with the challenges in the financial market. In this context, what are your thoughts? In modern conditions, extra financial stimulus, does it present economic risks or not? Kenan, would you?
If you look at the history in countries where modern monetary theory has been applied, and I would list Chile, 1970 to 1973, Peru, 1985 to 1989, Argentina under the Kirchner and Fernandez regime from 2003 to 2015. I'd also include Venezuela and a number of other Latin countries, maybe Turkey, maybe Israel. Sebastian Edwards, co-author of the book with Rudy Dornbush, would list France. It works for a while. The prediction, if we implement this, I think from history, is that you'll get an economic boost for a number of years. And how long that will last depends on initial conditions. In the case of Argentina and Venezuela, very favorable commodity prices, I think, flattered how well it did. And in Argentina, it really lasted quite a long time. However, and we haven't really spoken about this, but you subordinate the central bank to the government. In Argentina, one of my former students was a quite senior official at the central bank afterwards and said literally under the Kirchners, the central bank's job was to load trucks with cash and ship them to the Treasury for the Treasury to spend. That's a bit of a facetious, but you are eventually going to run into problems if it's not sustainable. Eventually you get inflation, eventually you get exchange rate depreciation, and then there's a whole dynamic coming in with exchange controls. And these episodes have typically ended with very high inflation and budget collapse. And I'd emphasize, importantly, and this is in Dornbusch and Edwards' book, and also in other writings, that the real exchange, the real wage rate actually ends up lower at the end of all this than it is at the beginning. So the question is, what can you do on a sustainable basis? And I would just, again, reemphasize the point that subordinating the central bank to the fiscal authorities is a catastrophic mistake. It's been one of the great innovations of the last 35 or 40 years. And in the case of Russia, I was here in 2015, January of 2015, and I have to say, things looked pretty grim. Oil prices had collapsed, there were the sanctions. It looked like Russia, and Russia had a lot of foreign currency debt. It looked like the possibility of financial crisis very high. And I would say the Russian central bank reacted, with great energy and technocratic expertise. I mean, of course, it's not as independent in Russia as it is in the United States and Europe. They clearly had the president's support.
It's more independent, actually.
Okay, but we can agree I think they did an incredible job. You did not have a financial crisis. You can complain about the ruble being lower, and that's just something not to take lightly, because in these cases where the central bank's been subordinated, there's no line of defense.
James?
Well, let me come back to the basic point about modern monetary theory. With all respect to Kenneth Rogoff, it is not a set of policy prescriptions that you pull out of the air to apply in particular circumstances. It is a descriptive analysis of how credit-based financial systems actually work, how they work in the United States, how they work in Japan, how they work in any country, especially those which have a degree of sovereignty over their money and credit systems. Now, the question had to do with what the risks of excessive budget deficits actually are. And in the world, these vary with the circumstances that a country faces, with the world conditions, with the external balance of a country, and with the policy tools that are in use. So we have the case of Japan, and Japan has very high deficits in public debt, as you mentioned, over 200% of GDP, but no inflation and no impairment of its access to credit markets. It is a country with a sovereign monetary system in which the public debt is held partly by the Bank of Japan, partly by the Japanese private sector, and partly outside. The United States, in the Second World War, ran budget deficits of 25% of GDP for 4 consecutive years, along with price controls, a degree of rationing, and it had a 2% bond rate on U.S. government bonds. So it has no problem of financing what was effectively a doubling of the size of the American economy in that period. Greece, in the modern world, is in a different situation. It lacks sovereign control over its credit system and is entirely dependent upon a set of rules and constraints which are imposed upon it from the outside, and entirely dependent upon the sufferance, if you like, of its creditors, who have been extremely harsh toward the country. But broadly in the world economy, since the 1980s, there have been no major resource constraints apart from the environmental ones that we are not dealing with. And a number of large countries, notably China, but also to a substantial degree the United States, and to a degree Japan as well, have taken pretty good advantage of those conditions in order to maintain rates of growth, social stability, and in the case of China, an enormous amount of economic development. This is what you can do when you set your mind to it. Europe is another case. It has not, partly because European countries have been, shall we say, in thrall to a financial orthodoxy, which has advantaged creditors but greatly disadvantaged the debtor countries within the European Union. You can see the consequences of this as a deep social economic crisis, also a political crisis, which is presently unfolding, for example, in France. So this is a difference between the successful application of a resource-using policy and the reluctance or the failure to use the resources which would otherwise be available. In the cases that Ken mentioned, countries, Argentina, for example, faced a deep crisis as the result of the failure of hyper-orthodox policies in the early 2000s, was able to recover from that for 10 or 15 years. Of course, favorable external conditions helped, a good policy helped, and things don't last forever. Conditions turned unfavorable in 2014 or so, things became difficult again. But Argentina and the other countries he mentioned are examples of countries which do not have the capacity, or at least are not willing to exercise the capacity to control their internal monetary and credit systems in the way that is not a problem for the United States, Japan, and which other countries, including Russia, have to take certain steps in order to assure that they do, in fact, have an adequate degree of control.
И какой же российский взгляд на это?
So, what is the Russian view on this? Well, what is important to understand in this situation is that budget deficit constraints have to do with inflation. The presenters we have today would agree with this. It's a matter of source of demand, whether it's stimulated by the government, whether it's stimulated through credit. What is the balance in the economy? What are the goals of a national economy? Goals can be very different. There are different political agendas as well, but it all works as long as demand does not create inflation. What was the mistake that Argentina and Venezuela made? Countries that Kenneth mentioned, and Mr. Galbraith also mentioned that when they saw inflation, they never stopped. They continued to stimulate demand, thinking that this would bring them to the positive zone. But inflation is a big key problem that sends you a message about an upcoming problem in the economy, lack of demand or excessive demand. And this is something to look at when you want to achieve good results. As of Japan, well, Japan was forced to come to this situation. They went through a period of trials and tribulations. They experienced a long period of stagnation. And we see that in recent years, despite the fact that they had no issues with inflation, they have been taking steps to increase sales tax, to tighten their policy, and we see the negative consequences. We see a deterioration of the situation instead of improvements. I think that China is a good example of successful work. Look at the last 20 or 30 years. China has been working very thoroughly on stimulating demand. Depending on what is happening, they keep stable level of demand. Look at the situation they have there. We see the mix of demand, which depends on the phase of an economic cycle. At some point in time, they had zero deficit. Today, the official numbers are around 6% of the GDP. Private loans are not growing, so they increase the budget deficit. They create a good balance, public demand and private demand. There is really no border between these two things in China. Public expenditures and private banks, there's a lot of government banks which offer loans to those industries which are looked at as priority areas for economic development. If you look at the big picture, China is a country that has not suffered from any big crisis over the 30 years period. Inflation is very stable. It's around 2% during this whole time. So we can learn quite a bit from China. They have good experience. One of the statements of the modern economic theory is the requirement for countries to be sovereign in monetary terms. for a country to be able to issue currency and borrow in national currency. What do you gentlemen think about it? This is very relevant for Russia. The ability to issue debt and to borrow in national currency, to give national currency the status of a reserve currency. Do you think this is relevant in today's world? We understand that no matter what you call a policy, whether you think that it is in line with the modern monetary theory or not. What should it be? James, would you?
Are able to borrow in their own currency have a definite advantage in that they don't face a hard currency constraint on their public finances. They don't have to raise funds from outside in order to service their debts. But the point I would make about that is that the ability to borrow in your own currency is dependent upon policy and institutions. An important example of this in the modern world is China, which does not have the RMB, the renminbi is not a reserve currency yet. Maybe coming into one, but it has not been one in recent decades. And yet China is able to pursue an independent domestic policy because it maintains capital controls. I was in the 1990s for a period of 4 years chief technical advisor to the State Planning Commission of the People's Republic for macroeconomic reform. And one of the issues that came up was whether they should liberalize the capital account and permit a free transfer of assets in and out of the country. And along with several distinguished senior economists from the United States, we argued very strongly against that, and they did not do it. And having maintained that degree of control, it's not perfect, but having maintained that degree of control, China has been able to finance the extraordinary growth and development of the past 25 years. Now, the United States doesn't have capital control, but doesn't need it. It maintains a large and liquid market for government bonds. And in the case of the United States, we have the immortal words of in the late 19th century of the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck that Almighty Providence looks after drunks, fools, and the United States of America. The distinction between being able to or not being able to issue bonds that serve as a store of value is, in fact, a critical marker of whether a state is truly sovereign in its economic sphere. Again, I mentioned earlier Greece, where I had the privilege of working for 4 or 5 months at the side of the finance minister in 2015. Greece lost this privilege when Greek bonds were transferred from Greek law to British law in 2012. Up to that point, the state could, in fact, haircut its own bonds at the stroke of a pen if it was, in fact, necessary. Afterwards, it could not. It was a straightforward legal transfer of sovereignty over a critical matter from the government of Greece to the creditors, in effect. So it is important to be able to borrow in your own currency. It is a privilege that is accorded to the countries at the center of the world monetary system, but other countries can achieve the same effect if they're willing to implement the appropriate policies. And I should add that capital control was something that was clearly envisaged in the charters of the International Monetary Fund in 1944-45. So it is not an irregular procedure by any means, and capital controls have been used. They've been used by Malaysia, they've been used by Chile, they've been used by numerous countries that are fully part of the world system, as well as by China in its transition period.
Kenneth, last мнение?
Yeah, let me make a few points. First of all, it's very difficult in today's world for most countries to be completely sovereign in finance because of the dominance of the dollar. Japan has something like 70% of its imports denominated in dollars, 50% of its exports. You can go to France and look at French corporates, and they're now issuing something like 35% of their debt in dollars, because that's what's the demand for. And so there's a certain amount of sovereignty that's not there for most countries. The United States is in a very privileged position. The second point I want to make is that when we talk about debt in the modern state, what we're really talking about is what I term in my work senior market debt, and it's not really capturing the whole picture of a country's liabilities. I think there are other things which are you can, in principle, walk away from, but it's very difficult, with pensions being and old age support being a leading example. Take the case of Italy. The debt's famously something like 130% of GDP, but that's nothing compared to their pensions. Publicly provided pensions are 16% of GDP, not of government spending, of GDP in Italy. And even in the United States, they're 7%. I think the right way to look at government debt in the modern state is it's this little sliver of senior market debt that is going to get paid because there are a lot of resources, but there's a ton of debt below it. And just referring to what's going on in this senior debt and seeming to spend it because you don't have a problem because it's senior and you have a lot of resources. And you know, lastly, Russia, I think certainly falls more in the category of an emerging market here than it falls in the category of Japan and the United States in terms of its true monetary independence in the world. And that isn't to say that it hasn't done very well and been able to maintain macroeconomic stability, but I think it's done so by following these orthodox principles that are time-tested. And you know, we can talk about Japan and China later, but there are a lot of countries in the world, and there have been a lot of problems over history when you have a central bank that's subordinate to the government.
Максим Станиславович.
Я, может быть, начну с реакции на последнюю.
Well, I first would like to respond to Kenneth's what he has just said. Problems it's not when they finance something, but when they fail to respond to excess demand, when the inflation starts growing, and they respond to that by imposing stricter policy, and then that could be a problem. Like a Russian case, 2015, 2016, our analysis right now shows that the strongest anti-inflation imposed was the reduction of budget deficit. That was the channel from big indicators that we had. We reduced budget deficit very much, and that cooled down inflation, brought down the inflation. Inflation is a measure, I would say, of how the policy, economic policy efficient is. Now, currency sovereignty and debt sovereignty, it's a key thing for a sovereign economic policy. Unless you have your own currency with a well-developed debt market, you cannot pursue your independent economic policy. You would always be dependent on the outside world. Some countries would delegate this to other countries. There are all sorts of regimes like currency board, etc., where fully the sovereignty in currency policy would be given out to other countries, and the economy in particular country would be determined by those other countries. That would reduce the risks of making big mistakes. But on the other hand, that economic policy would be developed not on the basis of the situation in a particular country you're in, but based on some other reasons. One great example there is Europe, because on the one hand, in terms of the monetary policy, the countries have lost their sovereignty. There's no common fiscal policy, no banking union. It's like a half-hearted economic union, and that has resulted in a situation where Greece and other countries don't have their sovereign economic policy. As a result, they have those problems in the European zone that we see happening over the past 10, 20 years. And getting back to this issue of currency and That sovereignty, it's an absolutely important condition for modern economic policy, sovereign one. Well, we keep on getting back to an issue of what is within this scope of the fiscal policy, and in the modern monetary theory, monetary and fiscal policy are intertwined in a way. But the coordination of monetary and fiscal policy is something being considered in the traditional macroeconomics. But in the modern world, in this discussion of modern monetary theory, my question to the panelists, what do you think about transformation of the understanding, transformation of monetary policy in the future? Kenneth?
Well, I mean, I think another way to look at it is that monetary policy institutions have actually been very successful, and in many countries, fiscal policy institutions have not been successful. They're very political. It's interesting, I'm at the American Economic Association meetings, and there are many papers on how fiscal policy can work in a Keynesian cross-ISLM diagram that completely oblivious to political economy. So in my country, the United States, when the Democrats are in power, and let's say really in power, stimulating the economy means making the government larger. And by the way, I agree with that at the moment of where we are. The Republicans, when they're in power, they think, well, let's do tax cuts and try to aim to make the economy smaller. It creates quite a bit of instability. Perhaps there are some countries where you don't face this political volatility, but I think the idea that fiscal policy can provide surgical precision in stabilization is misguided. And it very much goes to the question of what Maxime gave the case where Russia reacted, as he rightly says, in all macroeconomic policy very appropriately, at least to prevent the crisis. In many situations, it's very difficult for the politicians to do that. We talk about, okay, we'll do big deficits, big spending, and when things get tough, we'll pull back. That is not easy to do in the heat of battle. And I think we're having an independent central bank that sort of prevents there being a financial crisis, prevents there from being an inflation crisis, and pulls things back in a more technocratic way, has worked in many, many countries, is a very important role. If we created an independent fiscal policy or more technocratic fiscal policy, and perhaps you have one here, I'm not going to comment, but if you do, then you can do a lot more with fiscal policy than you can do if fiscal policy is very volatile and unpredictable. And I'll add lastly, I worked at the U.S. Federal Reserve, our central bank, was my first job out of graduate school, and that was a long time ago, 1980. And interestingly, it was just developing then as a center of technocratic expertise. If you went back to 1970, it was the U.S. Treasury that had all the technocratic expertise. It was the U.S. Treasury that navigated the change out of from fixed exchange rates to floating exchange rates. So these issues are certainly linked. If you build up the technocratic expertise, the independence in other institutions, you can share more of the macroeconomic stabilization responsibilities.
James?
Let me start answer this question by addressing the issue of central bank governance and central bank independence. I think it's obvious that having a central bank that is independent does not protect any country or region from financial crisis. The European Central Bank has been independent. Europe has been in deep crisis, and especially was in deep crisis over most of the past decade. I think the Europeans made a great deal of trouble for themselves by chartering a supranational central bank that was essentially accountable to nobody and not accountable to any democratic institution in Europe, very nominally and ineffectively to the European Parliament. In this respect, it seems to me, that the United States has a much better model. While we talk about central bank independence in the United States, the United States Federal Reserve is in fact a statutory agency created by the United States Congress in the Federal Reserve Act. Like other regulatory agencies, it is independent of the executive branch, but it is not independent of the Congress. It is accountable legally and constitutionally to the United States Congress and has, since the middle 1970s, been responsible for reporting to Congress on a very regular basis about its policy. The hearings that were called the Conduct of Monetary Policy hearings and later the Humphrey Hawkins hearings. I know about this quite well because I drafted the statutory language in the middle 1970s that governs congressional Federal Reserve accountability to the U.S. Congress. And it's under a mandate which is not strictly an ideological mandate about price stability based upon a set of economic ideas which have fallen out of fashion since they were powerful in the 1980s, but a dual mandate, a multiple mandate, but principally a dual mandate that emphasizes both full employment and reasonable price stability. So the Federal Reserve is an entity which is responsive to the elected United States Congress in principle. Congress gives it a lot of leeway, that's appropriate, but the responsibility and the legal relationship is not one of full independence as is often claimed. And I think that is a reason why the United States was able to react more responsibly and more effectively to the financial crisis a decade ago than was the case in Europe. In terms of the future, it seems to me quite clear that we've gone through a generation in the West where economic growth has been largely propelled by the periodic accumulation of private debts. Mortgage debts, household debts, automobile debts, student loan debts. All of these things are essentially the drivers of consumption spending in the United States. And these things they're cyclical. They go up and they go down. We are coming to after 10 years or so, we are very far into a period of expansion fueled by private debt. And this is not going to go on forever. So the future definitely lies with the alternative, which is economic initiatives taken by public sector actors or by public and private partnerships. And we see this in the world as well as in our own, in the Western countries. We see this specifically in China, where the Belt and Road Initiative is probably the single most important thing that is happening in the world today that will change the structure of the global economy going forward. Nothing like it is emanating from the West at the present time. So it's very important to recognize the Chinese are not relying on private households taking out debt in order to build out what they view as the crucial infrastructure for their resource supply and their international relations and their trade relations in the future, as well as the security of their international relations. In the West, we have initiatives which see and have the potential to do similar things. They are going under the name of the Green New Deal. They are not yet fully developed, and they're certainly not we do not have governments in place that are prepared to implement them. But to the extent that we decide that we're going to face, in particular, the climate challenge, the energy transition, and building out a society in which one can live better on a sustainable resource base, we are going to have to do that using the instruments of state power, and that means using fiscal policy explicitly in the future. So that's where, if we're going to have something other than a permanent situation of secular stagnation, which our societies will not tolerate for a long period of time, we have to be prepared to reacquire, let's say, the initiative that is defined by a degree of public purpose objectives that we face, and in fact, that we tackle as a society, and indeed as a global community.
Ну, вот исторически...
Well, historically, the opinion has been that monetary policy is one thing and fiscal policy is a different thing. One is impossible for demand and inflation, and the second is for structural thing and growth. But we see an actual thing that in the world experience, this is no longer so. The borders are no longer there. In the monetary policy, a lot of structural effects, like Europe and the United States, zero interest rates result in the increase in the price of assets, change in the wealth of the economy, structure of the income in the economy, or change in the structure of loans, like the example of the United States. The change of regulation there on the banking side has resulted in very serious changes of what happened in the American economy and the world economy in the future. The action, monetary action changed the structure. That's on the one side. On the other side, there's the Japanese situation. Well, 240% government debt of GDP, a lot of budget deficit. If they start experiencing surplus demand at a certain point in time, and to constrain that is not would be in the increase in interest rates. In the case of Japan, increase in interest rates would result in a situation when inflation would be stepped up because the budget deficit would grow through payment of more interest on rates and etc. Well, the main instrument would be fiscal policy through change in taxes or expenses. Only through this channel, in the case of excessive demand, Japanese would be able to control the situation. Kenneth expressed it very well. It's a technocratic approach, a result-oriented approach. We see two examples, and Mr. Galbraith also that example. I would change. I can compare China and Eurozone. Eurozone does have an independent central bank, independent fiscal policy in every country, and we see the result. It's non-technocratic approach and is not result-oriented. China is different. It's a universal common policy that government by the authorities of China, and everything's under their control. And no independence and technocratic approach brings better result in China than Eurozone. You should not be blindly guided by certain principles. You have to analyze the situation in a real way, controlling the demand and controlling the supply. So the borderlines no longer there between monetary and fiscal, and that's going to continue like this in the future. If a country manages to build a system that would be result-oriented, not influenced by political trend, they would achieve better results. And unless in other countries, where in Argentina, as an example given, if there is policy get against the upper hand, politics gain the upper hand, that would be a problem. In the course of this discussion, we've discussed more the developed countries more, but as been said before, Russia is an emergent market, emerging economy. So at the end of this discussion, I'd like to hear the opinion of the panelists. What do you think Russia should be doing and other emerging economies should be doing? And as an emerging economy, what can Russia do to accelerate its growth? James?
Start my answer to that question by saying one should be very cautious about taking advice from economists who just got off the airplane at that stage. But I think that's a lesson that does not need to be learned here. So just a few basic principles. One is that monetary sovereignty requires effective management of the financial relationships between a country and the rest of the world. And that's very clear. And in particular, that includes capital flows between the country, and this is, of course, a major issue, and it has been in the Russian Federation. So, in part, it's a question of the internal distribution of wealth and the relationship of the citizenry to the national government, and the effective distribution of capital holdings and the effective taxation of concentrated wealth is a crucial element in assuring that one has a stable, democratic, and financially sovereign economy. This is something also that's very important with respect to how the national resource patrimony is managed. Second point I would make that seems to me from my experience with Russia to be important here is that Russia has a great strength in developing high levels of amenities, which are essentially consumption goods, that are shared in common by the population. That is, say, a very high quality of education, a very high quality of urban life, a very high quality of arts and culture, and other aspects of national life, which are not necessarily specifically owned by particular individuals, and therefore can be provided reasonably, economically, and sustainably to the broad population. The more one can do that and build a high-quality life on that basis, the better off you are in the world where you have difficulty essentially with the general availability of resources. And the third point I would make is that economic growth, particularly as we measure it, which is essentially a question of measuring transactions, the growth in that particular number is not the most important variable. What is important is the quality of life. What is important is the health status and the life expectancy of the population. What is important is the sustainable management of environmental and natural resources. And what is important is the social stability. And all of these things, these are complex matters which are not adequately captured by a variable that was invented for entirely different purposes in the 1930s and 1940s, in particular for the management of the mobilization of the war economy in the 1940s. So one has to have a good sense of what the objectives are. A high rate of growth may facilitate getting to some of these objectives, but it may well not be where the most important priorities are at any given time.
Okay, Kenneth.
First of all, I want to thank my fellow panelists, Jamie and Maxime, for many excellent comments and for this discussion. I want to quickly make 2 points before I come to your question. One is I think Professor Galbraith raised the point about sustainability. Virtually every economist, at least in the United States, favors having a carbon tax, I would say a global carbon tax, although I think something needs to be done from the advanced countries helping support this in the less developed economies where it could be very expensive. I've made my own proposals. Second, on China, I will only say my 2009 book was Carmen Reinhard was entitled "This Time is Different" because we go through, it's a quite quantitative book, we go through one case after another where countries said, well, this works, because this time is different. China is the "this time is different" story, and I think as they have to slow down significantly in the coming years to a much lower growth rate, that's going to be a very painful process. Lastly, on Russia, I do think it's salient to look at the IMF report card on Russia, not to say they're always right by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a starting point. And I would say the way I read the Article 4 that IMF wrote in the last few for Russia is macroeconomic policy A or A minus, microeconomic policy C minus, that there's so many things that could be done to improve growth. They start with antitrust policy, the excessive power of the state, problems with the legal system. I completely agree that the Russian people are extraordinarily creative, and in fact, Russians around the world are leaders in technology, finance, and many things. But Russia has not been entirely successful in harnessing this at home, and that's where the real growth opportunities are in Russia. Yes, supported by good fiscal policy and macroeconomic management, that's important, but the areas where the really big room for improvement is much more in building up the private sector dynamism. I don't think the problem in Russia is at all the problem that the private sector's grown and the public sector hasn't. It's just the opposite.
Максим Александрович, я не знаю, совет от вас или уже...
У меня, может, три тезиса.
I can bring up 3 points. One is relevant for any emerging economy. In macroeconomic policy, I liked what Kenneth said. We should be more technology-oriented. We should not follow dogmas and myths. We should look at real situations and act accordingly. Inflation is a bright indicator that shows problems in the economy, lack of demand or excessive demand. In Russia, there are 2 things. In Russia, we have achieved quite a lot through avoiding high inflation. This was a serious achievement, and today the situation is radically better than 5 or 10 years ago. What's important is that Russia should not drive itself into the low demand trap. There are some formal causes for that. We can see that there are certain threats in Japan. In Russia, we don't have that. The third point is where I agree with Kenneth. We should focus on long-term growth factors because this will bring long-term success. We should reduce barriers in the economy, make the system more efficient, better distribute resources in the economy. That is always beneficial for long-term development. This is something to always bear in mind. We should look up at the long-term factors and avoid short-term mistakes. Thank you very much to all panelists. Now I would like to pass the floor to the experts that we have invited to our session. Oleg Vyugin, over to you. What kind of comments can you share with us? I would rather ask a question. I really want to hear the answers that our panelists could give me. We have witnessed this interesting discussion. We talked about the modern monetary theory. Several people mentioned the following. The main central banks today carry out a fairly soft monetary policy, low interest rates. We don't see high inflation. Mr. Reshkin said this, at least that's how I understand it. There are a lot of resources available. The world economy has quite significant resources, and those resources can support this soft policy addressing the demand. Is this the right understanding, or is this a primitive interpretation of what I heard? Also, there is another consideration. That is, some people believe that today we are witnessing economic growth, which is based on high level of debt, corporate debt and sovereign debt. We are also we're talking about major economies because that's where we are witnessing it. Japan, European Union, and the United States, although their cumulative corporate debt is lower than in other parts of the world. Maybe the formula is changing in the modern monetary theory. The debt variable is playing a much bigger role than it did in the past. When debt is low, it is supported by savings. When there are savings in the economy, those savings get transferred into the debt. If there is a distortion, if central banks or governments add more savings artificially, that creates inflation. Has this changed? I'm sorry, maybe my questions are too abstract. Well, if I were to talk about the first question, why there is no inflation, there is only one answer. It means that the demand that is created is not sufficient. It's not higher than the production capacity of specific economies and of the global economies. Look at Japan, look at the European Union. In Europe, they had high unemployment for a long period of time, and they definitely could cope with higher level of demand easily, but they didn't do that for understandable institutional reasons. As of the debt level, well, let me make one correction. It's not that savings create debt. When debt is created, that is related to savings. This is like a double record in the central bank, which is like any commercial bank, essentially. With high corporate debt, many would focus on sovereign debt. Budget deficit creates assets in the private sector. When the debt level is high, it's difficult to achieve growth without greater private sector assets. In Japan, they try to create assets this way. We have a different situation in this country. Private debt is not high in our economy. The rates are high, and there is a potential for private growth still, which is quite good. We think that there is good potential. There is no universal cure for all economies, though. One cannot say that 3% of budget deficit is the constraint that everybody should follow. Every economy is different and unique, and the differences are very significant. So they have to use different tools to address different situations.
Oh, that's on. First of all, on inflation, I think honestly nobody completely understands it. So Maxim's explanation is certainly part of the story, but it surprised everyone. And I haven't really seen a completely coherent theory. I suspect, of course, there are countries where we have seen it. Argentina is a dramatic example. But I think people who promise you it's not going to come back is really something that's foolish. I do think the footprint of the financial crisis is bigger and longer lasting than people are quite understanding. It's made people very nervous about something else happening. It's made people more hesitant about investment. But there are other factors, and for example, the falling cost of investment goods has been a big factor in pushing down interest rates. It's also true inequality has been a factor in pushing down interest rates because wealthy people have a lower spending proportion of their income. And I think if we have a more progressive fiscal policy in the United States, it actually doesn't need to have budget deficits. It could. But just redistributing income and the level of redistribution's low in the United States compared to many other countries, just redistributing income will be quite a macroeconomic boost. And there's potential for seeing that in other places in the world.
Okay, very briefly, the reasons why there is no inflation. There has been no inflation, essentially, in the world economy since the 1980s. And that is due to a very changed situation with respect to resources and a very changed situation with respect to wages. The power of the unions was broken in the United States. And in the world situation, the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of China created a essentially disinflationary situation in the world economy as a whole. And price level is now set at the world level on most essential things. With respect to interest rates, the fact that the monetary policy was used as the primary line of response to this situation, and then especially to the crisis 10 years ago, has meant there has been a lock-in of low interest rates. As the long-term interest rates have come down, there's an expectation that low interest rates will be maintained, it becomes very much harder for central banks to raise the short rates because it creates financial chaos when they do. So they talk about it, occasionally they try, and then they pull back because they see that it's causing a great many disruptions, particularly in asset markets on which they rely to sustain the illusion of economic prosperity. So I don't think I think the situation that we have now is historically different from what it was in the early post-war period and what it was before the financial crisis. I agree with Ken on that there's, we're in a situation where achieving high rates of growth for a number of reasons is structurally much more difficult than it was before.
Олег Замулин, ваш мнение.
Уважаемые коллеги, уважаемые
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I think one important conclusion that we arrived at, it was something that Mr. Oreshkin said. There are no silver bullets, no universal cures. There are many countries where the situation is such that one can increase sovereign spending and increase public debt, and this will not bring catastrophic consequences. But this does not mean that this logic can be followed in all parts of our life. And this is something that Mr. Rogov said. I would like to follow up on what Mr. Oreshkin said, that is the connection between savings and investment. This was talked about a little, but I have a few questions. I have always been taught, and I taught my students that savings are good in long term. Savings translate into investment. Investment increases our production capacities. Economic growth is getting faster. In the last 2 decades, I've been witnessing a change. In the last 10 years, we have seen secular stagnation. A lot of savings in the world do not translate into investment. Corporations are more risk avert. They do not invest. We see low interest rates. We see growing debt, which does not turn into greater production capability. Before financial crisis, we have seen some investment that was investment in various bubbles. Dot-coms came first, and then housing. This brings about a question. Should I continue to teach my students that savings is good, or should I review my attitude to this part of macroeconomic theory? Let me respond to you by saying this. If you want to achieve economic growth, you cannot do it without investment. How can you create demand for investment? What happens in developed economies? Why there is less demand? Why invest if the current capacity is sufficient to satisfy the existing demand? To create greater investment, you have to increase consumption because it would create demand. There's got to be a good balance. That is an answer to your question. There is no universal cure. To increase investment, you have to use different instruments. There's got to be proper balance of demand. And investment should match the demand. This combination can give you the desirable results. So you have to be somewhat technocratic and scientific. Cumulative demand should be right, and you should follow the right policy to achieve that goal. Some areas require greater investment. In some areas, you have to focus on redistribution of wealth. We see that this issue is becoming much more talked about in the United States. We have to teach our students that there are no universal instruments that can help in every situation.
Finance investment, or the savings creates investment, was a fallacy when Jean-Baptiste Say articulated in 1802. It's been a fallacy for 200 and some years, and it's still a fallacy. Sufficient to say.
Kenneth, brief answer.
Yeah, I mean, we don't actually teach, oh, sorry. I don't think we quite teach that savings is good. We teach that consumption is good. But as Maxime said, you need savings to have investments so that you can keep on consuming and consuming more. And the questions, the balance, and certainly the fact the interest rate has fallen so far is certainly illustrative at the end of the day of having pressure from savings relative to investment. And I think certainly one of the factors generating this has been the really good investment opportunities are not in the advanced countries. They're aging, they're already at the technological frontier. The really good investment opportunities are elsewhere. However, in many emerging markets, we could look at the Middle East, we could look at Asia. They really don't want to hold all their money locally because even though the returns are high, the risks are also high. And we see this flood of money coming into the advanced economies. My own view is this is probably a cycle and not a trend that goes on forever, but it's very difficult to predict.
Большое спасибо всем участникам дискуссии.
Thank you to all the panelists. Unfortunately, we were running short of time, and I hope that we've been able to elucidate something on modern monetary theory. Of course, there will continue to be differences on this matter. Thank you very much.